everyone to our wonderful webinar today as we join the second in a three-part series, Navigating the Experiential Learning Triangle. Today we're looking at how employers can pivot to support interns remotely. I have two great panelists here today, Richard Turrell from Handle Recruitment and Holroyd Pearce from Virtual Internships. I'll let them introduce themselves and then get started.
Fantastic. Hi everyone, so my name is Richard Turrell. I'm Head of Marketing at Handle Recruitment. You'll actually see later in the slides, but I was a former supervisor at a former organisation I worked at, Stanton House, and yeah, I'm really excited to be here today.
Thanks, Richard. And yeah, I'm Holroyd Pearce. I can see a few familiar names in the attendees list, so nice to see you guys again, and nice to meet anyone new. I'm co-founder of Virtual Internships and also co-founder of CRCC Asia, so been in this space for 13 or so years, and at VI since it was incorporated a couple of years ago. So really excited to get started today, and just a quick thank you to Gillian and the team for putting this together and making it possible. So why don't we dive straight in? So I'm very aware that of the 100 or so registered attendees, we actually have a very large proportion who are from universities. So I'm going to be looking at this through the lens of a university. I'm primarily envisaging that you might have existing host companies who perhaps are a bit reticent about hosting a remote intern or would like some more information. So I hope I'll give some content that speaks to that challenge and issue, and also for those host companies that are attending directly. Hopefully this will give a bit of a flavor as to why you should be excited and certainly why you shouldn't be scared about hosting a remote intern. First of all, I want to say that everybody is at different stages. So there are small, medium, large organizations. There are people who've been working remotely and you know, employing people remotely for decades probably. There are also people for whom this is totally new. So in the short time we have, I'll aim to cover as much as possible and hope it's useful. And Gillian will be signposting some other resources which I hope are relevant. So first of all, you know, why should a company be interested in hiring a remote intern? Here on this slide, we've got a few of the key points that we think are worth highlighting to a company. Accessibility is number one, and indeed, when Virtual Internships was first created, it was really with that as a mainstay. It was looking at students who maybe had disabilities or who had family commitments, who could not relocate to another city or another country to do an on-site internship. Obviously, fast forward a couple of years and COVID-19 means accessibility is still the major focus, but it affects a lot more people. So still just keep that in the back of your mind that in terms of the candidate pool and in terms of where those candidates might be going, accessibility can and should be at the forefront of many discussions about why do a remote internship. Some companies will be doing it to build their brand awareness, and others to create a talent pipeline. I think those two go kind of hand in hand. And those can be quite exciting for companies looking at new markets as well. Again, this is something that Richard speaks to in his couple of slides later on. Obviously, many companies are very pragmatic and they actually want an intern to complete a necessary project. It sounds pretty obvious, but I think it starts to be a useful thing to understand when you're trying to keep everybody happy. University has to be kept happy, particularly if there's credit. The intern wants to be building skills. The host company wants to give their time creating a project and giving feedback and evaluation because they are getting a project done. So it's good to just bear in mind, I guess. And this final point, again, actually, I've obviously had a sneak preview of Richard's slides, and I know he is going to talk about this, but it's an opportunity, a really great opportunity to give some leadership and some mentorship skills to young management. And this is something that comes out quite a lot with, you know, host companies in different regions. So particularly in Asia, where we have a lot of host companies, they're quite risk averse. And if you told them they should go ahead and hire an expatriate on a large salary working remotely from a different culture, a different language, they would almost certainly not say yes. However, to persuade them to host a remote intern is comparatively low risk. So that can be a kind of a nice foot in the door, or a good reason and a way for persuading a host company that this is something useful to do. So then we're going to move on from the why to more about the how. And so looking at, what should be in place for a host company in the preparation stages. So first of all, we think some kind of contract or agreement has to be in place. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised at the number of people who think, oh, it's remote, it's more flexible, let's not put it all down in writing. Obviously, that's bad news. So virtual internships, we have terms and conditions, which enables us to very clearly lay out what is expected of the host company. And, that includes the student evaluations, that includes setting the projects, that includes, notifying the intern and or the university and or us if there are any changes, like change to the supervisor or change of location, change of hours, those kind of things. And, it takes away some of the guesswork, obviously. Next on our list, and this is not in order of importance, by the way, but just a few things that we wanted to hit up and talk about. Detailed placement plan. So there's plenty of different ways you could choose to do this. We've gone actually with a week-by-week requirement, week-by-week plan as a requirement for all our host companies. I have to say this wasn't always the case. It's something that we've moved towards because it actually, even with some experience, it's quite difficult to envisage number of hours per week unless you've got a week-by-week plan. So people can write a whole page of, about an internship and what the role involves, and it's still, a little bit of a challenge in some cases to pick apart and work out whether that's a couple hours a week or 10 hours a week or 20 hours a week or 30 hours a week. So actually, we think probably a week-by-week plan, certainly for a short-term 1, 2, or 3 month internship, is a good way to go. And just being willing to step back and look at that and say, is this really 20 hours work, or is it actually 3 hours work and the student is going to think they've completed it way ahead of time? So don't be afraid of asking for that. And if you're a host company, it's definitely worth putting in the time. I would say, having hosted my own interns as well, putting in a week-by-week placement plan is definitely worthwhile. Well-prepared and high-quality supervisor. So by this, obviously, prepared refers directly to the placement plan and could also touch upon, their preparedness for remote work. Have they got the technology? Have they got the technique and the skill set to be able to do that remotely? And when we say high-quality supervisor, it's obviously subjective, but one thing we look at is supervisors' LinkedIn. If somebody is good at articulating their own skill set and showing their career progression, the chances are their heart and mind are in the right place to supervise an intern. If they can't do those things, then it's worth digging deeper. It's not maybe not a definite no, but it's something we'd like to know more about. Best practice guides. I could honestly devote this whole webinar just to best practice guides, and Gillian is going to be signposting a few useful resources in her follow-up. But we've got some really great digital harassment guides. We've got host company best practice in terms of how frequently to check in, what a project looks like. So definitely look for these. Some of them were created pre-COVID, and many other companies, etc., have all come out in the last couple of months. They're still great, and definitely review as many best practice guides as possible. And the final point on this slide is just a reminder that the project, the work done, the whole experience needs to be mutually advantageous. And I think recognizing that and being clear about it up front is really important. So if a university is given credit, certain hoops may need to be jumped through. If the student has specific requirements, gain certain skills, or is looking for some certain exposure, then recognize that. And likewise for the host company, as we said on the previous slide, they want to get some stuff done and they don't want to be caught in a endless loop of sort of feedback or mentoring. So I hope that's useful, just as a reminder. So we had devoted a whole slide to communication. And again, we've got quite a lot of this in the resources that Gillian is going to send out. So I won't go into too much detail, but I would say, particularly when an internship is going cross time zone, get creative. We're all online. We're all getting used to using Zoom 5 times a day and keeping all of our documents in the cloud. We're all doing that already. But actually, when a supervisor might be giving a project to an intern, why not do it in a 20-minute recorded file that they can then upload and let the intern watch, perhaps watch once or twice and then ask questions. That way you don't need to ask somebody to wake up at 5 in the morning, or indeed stay up until 10 p.m. on a Friday night just to have that call. You can deliver that. And likewise, when an intern is delivering their project, they could actually do a recorded session. Let's say it's an Excel sheet, a model, a financial model. Get them to run through that in a 20-minute video, and that way the supervisor can watch it in their own time. So just try and be as inventive and use the technology as a benefit rather than as a ball and chain around your neck. Definitely choose a dedicated communication platform and make sure the intern knows that that's the main one you're going to be communicating on. We recommend phone and video chat each week. If there's a significant time difference, we might let that drop to every 2 weeks, as long as there were some videos and other contact in place. And we would still recommend best practice would be a daily check-in, either via email or some other messaging platform. And feedback. Feedback is a huge one. And again, I'm going to let Richard speak a bit more about this. The primary framework that we use is the NACE competencies. So that's 8 core competencies, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And that just obviously gives some structure to any feedback. And if you are working with an intermediary, such as virtual internships, I think it's really valuable in terms of magnifying the output and just making sure that the student is receiving as much value as possible from any feedback from the supervisor. So I am getting pretty short of time, so let's zoom through. This is really going to be my final big point, which is just don't get fixated on those easy career fields. So everybody knows that you can get a digital marketing intern and they can work remotely. That's kind of obvious. An example I'm going to give is pharmaceuticals. In the early days of the company back in 2018, we actually got approached by a student who was studying pharmacology and wanted to do a virtual internship. And we said, we can't picture that working remotely. Like we'd understand if you walk away, we're not sure we can do it. And actually the student themselves came up and said, I am fascinated by pharmaceutical regulation, and I would love to do some research and write some reports on regulations around different drugs in different regions if there's a company that's interested. And that really changed our mindset. That made us aware that a student can gain industry-specific knowledge, and they can gain commercial awareness. And yeah, they won't be able to work in a lab with test tubes, but they can still do something really useful remotely. So for anyone who's particularly fretting about those kind of careers, please don't panic, just try and think around it. It might involve, changing things up a bit, but it still can be done, okay? And that, probably needs to be reiterated for host companies in specific industries who might start off thinking it's not for them. So, again, this slide doesn't really need any explanation, and you'll be able to look at it later, but it just speaks to that accessibility piece in terms of the locations and also the career fields, with some engineering and finance is in there, which are, normally fields that people wouldn't want to be, remote in. So right now I'm going to hand over to Richard, and I'm going to, we've asked him to basically talk through a specific project to give our audience a feel for what a remote internship might look like and how it is to be the host company on that side of things. So Richard, over to you.
Fantastic, thanks Ed. So to set the scene, the concept of a virtual intern, it was absolutely new to me. And in my head, I approached it as I would an outsourced piece of work with a freelancer. So from a business perspective, we identified a business requirement, which was we were opening up a new office in Chicago, and it was going to specialize within cybersecurity. And then I spoke to our contact at Virtual Interns and said, if I could have somebody that would be able to support me to create an incredible briefing document so we can upskill everybody that is going into that office to get them to understand about our business, our culture, the space they're about to operate in. Do you have anyone that would be able to do that? So they threw a few CVs across to me, and it almost happened within a matter of days. We were matched with an incredible intern who had all of the skills required to be able to conduct this research project and to basically deliver on this business requirements that we had. The research was actually really, really in-depth, and it ended up being about a 200-page internal briefing document that went through from finding the most influential people within that space to him being able to take the latest insight and economic studies that had happened within that space and actually turn it into usable content that our sales team and our recruiters could learn from and then feed back into their network. We then expanded that out as well and took that little, or it wasn't a little briefing pack in the end, but taking this large briefing pack, and we turned it into external content as well that we started to position out to our client base and our customer base as well. The way that I worked with our virtual intern was actually a lot simpler than I expected it to be. When we created this project, the first thing I got him to do was to actually create his own project plan. So he went away and defined the milestones, and he also set a working pattern to maximize his own effectiveness. And that was one of the concerns I did have, was how would those 20 hours a week fit in around my workload? And the reality is, compared to an in-person intern, I'm not actually at my desk that often. So to have someone that was remote was actually incredible, because it meant that we blocked in set times to speak to each other, set times to have video calls, and set times where the onus would be on myself to review the work that he had done and then provide feedback as well. So it's actually a really structured relationship, which I probably didn't actually expect. But the biggest thing and the biggest piece of advice I can give to anyone going through this process would be to absolutely set the objectives and be very clear on what both of you want to get out of it, to make sure that throughout the relationship, you'll always tap back into the why and each other's why to really understand if you're going down the right path and you're both supporting each other. Perfect. So the next piece, and I guess I'm probably not too ashamed to admit this, but I'm not a big fan of admin. And when I was faced with this concept where I had to complete intern assessments and I'd have to sit down and answer questions, I did approach it with a little bit of trepidation. Very, very pleased and not too ashamed to say that I was proved wrong very, very quickly. So even though, going back to that last point, every time that I caught up with our virtual intern, we were always talking about the objectives. Were we on track? Were we achieving what we both wanted to achieve? Just spending that time to sit down and have to answer structured questions, and for both of us to do it, we actually found there was a lot of feedback where we could pivot and manipulate the projects that we were working on to actually make sure that the intern got more out of his internship, and from my side, the business objective was actually achieved in a more efficient and better way as well. So day-to-day focus, very much about coaching, but just being able to have these structured stages where you have to do a more formal assessment actually made the process a lot clearer.
Thanks, Richard. That's a really good level of detail. And I mean, for anyone who isn't, fully aware of how our program worked with host companies. The host company supervisor basically fills in evaluations for the student on exactly the same NACE competency criteria as the student fills in themselves. So it ends up being quite a nice point where we can compare, the student, let's say, in this particular case, on oral and written communications. Before this text piece that we've copied onto this slide, there's actually just a competency rating. So how competent is the student at this? And the, looking at how that whether that matches up is great, and is what a lot of our student-facing coaching then built on. So if, in this case, your former intern had said, I'm really competent in my oral and written communication, I'm excellent, and you'd given a sort of, some room for improvement, we'd obviously have used that. Interestingly, we actually see it normally happen the other way around. It's that students are less confident, and host companies are singing their praises, and that's a really nice coaching call to deliver to students, to be fair. Okay, I'm gonna move on now just to the final thoughts, I guess, from Richard, which maybe helps segue into the Q&A. And I think we already heard that, it was a positive experience for both the intern and the host company. So maybe let's move straight on to the second point, which is what
can I just jump in there, actually, Ed?
Yeah, sure.
To summarize that one a little bit, and clearly it was an incredibly positive experience, and that did really help because the match was incredible. But going back to one of the points that you mentioned, one of the other things that I hadn't expected as well was I had a high potential junior member of my team that hadn't really managed anyone, lacked supply management experience. So I actually pulled that person into the process as well, and used the weekly reviews and assessments for them to actually learn as well. So even if people have individuals within their teams or businesses that aren't quite ready to take on an intern fully, there's definitely an opportunity that I found where you could just bring them into bits and pieces to build up their experience as well. So that was, I guess, kind of one of those unexpected benefits that I found as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for adding that. So yeah, very useful. I guess the final piece would just be what recommendations would you give to a host company that was maybe teetering on or verging on thinking about a virtual intern or a remote intern? What was the most difficult thing for you to get your head around, and how would you approach it now?
The most difficult thing was just kicking it off. And I know I oversimplified it, but when you speak to that person the first time, it's a little like hiring someone. You have that gut feeling around whether you can work with that person. And as long as you set very clear expectations at the beginning, I really don't see any way that it can fail, because the feedback that you are able to provide to virtual internships as well, if anything goes wrong, they will be able to support you with that. But all of the reservations I had were kind of removed very, very quickly. But the most important thing is just to make sure that you have a really positive bond with the intern that you have. And you also create quite a high trust environment as well. So I wanted my virtual intern to push back on me and challenge me as well. And there are actually quite a few things that I was proven to be doing not quite as well as I could, but again, they felt confident to tell me about that. So it was a nice learning curve for me as well.
Sure, great, thank you.
Well, wonderful, both Ed and Richard. I am aware of time, and I really do appreciate the great content that you just went over. So now what we're going to do is open the floor up to questions. Please do just add it into the Q&A. It's called Q&A up at the top of your Zoom screen. And we do have a couple questions already. So we're going to start with Michelle's question. So Michelle's asked, employers' capacity has changed due to COVID because of budget, layoff, and much more. So how have your pitches or requests to employer host sites changed? And have any projects or learning objectives shifted, or new industries emerged as in high demand or low demand of virtual internships?
That's a great question. I would say the first thing is geography. With the background that Virtual Internships has, with CRCC Asia being the parent company, we've always had strong roots in China, Japan, Korea. And actually, although those geographies were affected really early on with COVID, they're actually coming out fairly well now. And, you know, none of us has a crystal ball. We don't know how other geographies are going to be affected. But I think there will always be places in the world coming out of the COVID scenario and willing to, you know, basically doing a lot of business. And, you know, I think also people are more open to remote communication and slightly less scared of just having an intern that's at the end of an internet connection. So those are all positives. And there are obviously going to be some businesses that feel they just need to hunker down and, you know, just get on with their core operations, and they don't have time for an intern. And I would hope that with some structured but, you know, pared back feedback, it's not such a big step for them. In terms of industries, I think it really depends on which geography you're looking at and what the economies are operating. Sorry to not be too specific on that one.
Perfect. No, and the other thing to consider is the switch over the last 2 months. Think about how comfortable you were with Zoom meetings 2 months ago and how comfortable you are now. More industries are realizing that they can deliver virtual opportunities, so they're less restricted now than they were even 2 months ago when you spoke about it, even in light of COVID. So a great question for Richard and Ed is, how can you create an environment where interns feel part of the team and the company at large, even from a remote distance?
If I can jump in and answer that one. Clearly, again, the last couple of months have probably brought this to the front of our minds a little bit more. Rest assured, I'm not going to say that all of them should be doing weekly quizzes and being on Zoom all day, every day. But I personally found it was connecting them to people in the business that they wanted to speak to. So my virtual intern was looking potentially for a future career within finance. So I approached my finance director at the time, explained the business impact that the virtual intern was having on our business with the project he was working on. And then I asked him to interview her. So it felt like it was a relationship where he got to know more about her, and likewise, because she could see the value that he was having to the business, she was more than happy to support him. Within my smaller team, it was just about keeping them engaged. So I didn't do this, but in hindsight, I should have added the virtual intern to our WhatsApp group. I should have probably pulled him in a little bit more to some of the team meetings, whereas for the first time at the time I did rely more on asking people to reach out to him and have conversations rather than bringing him into the wider business conversations. But I think the COVID crisis has taught me a lot about managing people remotely as well. And I definitely think there are a lot of things that you could do to help support that person and make them feel embedded within your organization.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, and I guess just to add to that, if I may, and also add in one question that came into the chat function about virtual networking. I'm hearing of people doing a lot of exciting things. A large law firm is actually running like virtual yoga sessions for their summer interns. You know, with partners, some partner has to say yes to the yoga session with the interns as well. You know, but those kind of things do break the ice. We've done remote lunch and learns as well, which is quite a, you know, relaxed activity. Eating's a good one. You know, it's difficult to do virtually, but you can actually say, look, we're going to put our Zoom on and each bring our own different lunch, and then it's a talking point. And sometimes you just got to embrace the awkwardness when you're thinking of networking opportunities or ways to break the ice.
Perfect. And to finalize that question as well, is remember that the technology that you have right now can be adapted really creatively. I was just on a Zoom call with 200 people that effectively use breakout rooms and more for a networking experience. They had 3 people kind of navigating the management of the room, but it was all done without any other special equipment. So don't think that you're limited by your technology. think creatively how to use the technology. We are right at noon, and I did promise everyone that this was a 30-minute webinar. So I do just want to let everyone know that next week we will have our final in the 3-part series, looking at how students can access and succeed at virtual internships. And this is a webinar geared to universities supporting students. We will stay on the line and answer all of these great questions, but if you do need to head off or sign off, please do check back later, and I will send you that link so you can see all the questions and answers more. Moving beyond that, I do want to thank you again so much for joining us and giving your time, and thank you so much, Ed and Richard, as well, for being panelists.
Not at all, thank you. It's been great, and I'm happy to hang around for a few minutes to answer some more questions. There are some really good ones there in the Q&A box.
Perfect. So yeah, let's get on to the questions, because Rich, it's your question next. What would you do if the intern was not as effective as your wonderful intern you had? How can you manage trouble from afar?
Oh, that's an incredible question. The obvious thing is I would automatically go back to my contact at Virtual Internships and say, I am having this problem. Before I approach it, is there anything that you found within your matching that you may be aware of around why this problem may be happening? Or were there any warning flags that you found whilst you're going through the matching process? Following that, it's just how I would manage anybody. So it goes back to having that high trust relationship, high trust environment where you're just talking to people. I did encounter, again, my virtual intern was incredible, but he had some family illness during his internship with myself. And if we didn't have that trust environment, you may have almost just felt where he wasn't being as quick to respond to your questions as usual, and you may think that that's a drop in his performance. Whereas he was very open with me, told me about the situation he was in at the time, and then we just flexed it. So we looked at, okay, you might not be able to do 20 hours this week, so why don't you just add a few more hours next week and just take some time off this week to get better in your head, to really, really focus on when you're in a good place to work. So even if you do have problems, and again, I know that when they're remote, you don't feel like you've got the whole picture, but it is really just asking probing questions to understand why there may be a drop in their performance, or why they may not be as effective as you expected, because there's usually actually a really, really simple solution that you can support them with as well.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. I'll take another couple of questions, hopefully take a couple off the list. So do host companies provide any financial compensation? At the moment, the vast majority, no. When they sign up as a host company, they get to tick the box, am I able to pay a stipend or salary? And there are a small percentage that do tick yes. From where we sit, the most important thing is the experience and whether the student comes out of it with skills to gain. That for us will remain the case. What we are seeing is more universities are actually covering the cost, so it ticks that accessibility box. I think one other question that was quite relevant was the international experience, and again that comes in with the cultural opportunities and influences. Again, I might actually just push this back to Gillian, because she's been instrumental in forming our program the way it is with the international component. So Gillian, did you want to add anything on that?
Sure. And I think the first thing is, when you're looking at remote work and you're looking at, do you offer sort of cultural opportunities, you have two different cultures that you need to get the student aware of. One, it's a workplace culture. A lot of students aren't even aware that they need to look for this, that workplaces differ from one place to the other, that the communication styles and more are very different. And something us as professionals take for granted that we know to look for, that we know how to manage a chat function versus an email, time and more. And so just like Rich said, bringing the students into those WhatsApp conversations, or bringing them into the fun part as well as the professional part of the office, as well as having a curriculum or university or provider support, telling them how to understand a workplace culture is going to be crucial. And then beyond that workplace culture is looking at the international aspects of it. we've made sure that all of our curriculum looks at the different kinds of workplaces that exist and cultures, vertical hierarchies, collectivist versus individualist, professional communication versus more laid back, and really targeted giving the scope of these opportunities in the global lens. So how can we teach students global networking, or showing an initiative in different workplaces or work types, language as a foundation, and understanding the culture and connecting with host companies, and much more. And so we've really looked at it in through those two different culture experiences, the global part and the workplace culture. And then we've tried to kind of frame our curriculum, our project structures, and any live webinars or information sessions we have with the students to look at both of those lenses. Another great question we asked was, there's been a lot, how do you make sure that virtual internships are bespoke for specific student groups? One of the biggest criticisms they've seen is that the work experiences are not aligned to various levels of students. IG looking at the student just starting their undergrad versus an MBA student. How can we really make sure that we work with our different host companies to ensure that the project and the process is matched effectively to the candidate and the host company?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd say the most material thing we have done in the last year or half year is bringing our candidate interviewing process online. So when candidates come on board the program, they actually do a recorded interview. And we have a couple of questions there, one of which we can send the host company. So that starts to actually clarify the students' articulation and their abilities, alongside obviously their resume and any answers they've given in their form about the skills they're looking for. So that definitely helps on an individualized basis. Otherwise, I would say that is where a program like ours adds value, because it allows us to curate the experience and to check the project, to vet the project, because otherwise it is just luck. Did the right student apply to the right company for the right level project, without somebody who's able to look through it?
Perfect. And that does also put onus back onto the structure of the placement plan, the project plan, and more. If you have a really good project plan, you'll know the level of skill. And if you've asked the right questions of the host company, you'll be able to match the right candidate. And that's the glory of an internship versus a course or a module, right? The fact that we can make it bespoke to every student, but it really comes on making sure that the project is well defined and that you've worked with the host company to really support them in understanding what the delivery is, what the ask is, and then to match the student. Another question is, how do you make this into an international experience beyond just working for a company in another country? So I guess this was asked a little bit with the international and cultural experiences. And I think one of it is just making sure that you have the university support or the provider support in unpacking those cultural experiences beyond the direct work that the student has with the supervisor. If you don't have that support to tie in all the dots, you won't get that global experience. It will just become a work experience. All these questions are this. So I think all the questions are just about that international experience. Did anyone else have anything to say about how to make an international experience from a remote opportunity? Ed or Rich?
So for me, in the early days of VI, I was doing some of the coaching calls, and I do feel like the framework helped, because as soon as you start asking people specifically, that's both the host company supervisor and the intern themselves, about intercultural awareness and any additional cultural aspects of their internship that they've noticed, they start to pay more attention. And then that's a kind of like virtuous feedback loop, virtuous triangle, where they're paying more attention. It's almost certain that in the 2 months, there's going to be a festival or a holiday or something cultural in the country of the host supervisor. And I mean, actually, I must say, Richard and his intern, Alex, were outside the norm. You know, most of our matches between host company and intern just happen to be across different cultures. So the fact that there is an additional, 2 cultures there, and the fact that both parties are being asked regularly throughout the internship about cultural awareness, it's not enough. It's never going to be enough. It's never going to be like being in another country, sitting at a food stall, eating local food, but it starts to make people think about it. And then the next time they have that opportunity to connect with their supervisor and ask about the holiday that, just happened, or even starting off with something like weather or food, does bring culture into it. So yes, they are learning about it, and I think it can often start a student down the route of, now I'm actually going to go and look that up. My supervisor told me a little bit about it, but they don't have 2 hours to spend, so I'm going to go and Wikipedia it. And even if that isn't a specific learning outcome, that they want for their own, LinkedIn profile, it happens, and then they become passionate. And I've witnessed it happen quite a lot in the last couple of years. So.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're out of questions, so I will just end with one final question.
Cool.
Ed and Rich, what is the biggest difference between an in-person and virtual opportunity, and what is the greatest benefit of that virtual opportunity?
If I answer that one first, I know I tapped or mentioned it a little earlier, but the biggest thing really is about the control. So I've had in-person interns in previous roles, and the challenge I always have, and it goes back to, I don't spend much time at my desk at all. So as soon as I walk away, I'll be back 2 hours later, and the intern, if it's in person, will be doing someone else's photocopying, will be doing someone else's shredding, making teas for a different team, because someone just looks at them and goes, that's an intern, I can use them to basically do my grunt work for me. The virtual internship, I actually felt like I had more control over it, because I was managing who in the business they were interacting with, the projects they're working on. They had clear milestones. It actually meant that they didn't deviate from the priorities, and they didn't get pulled into the traditional, why don't we get the intern to make the tea or get the mail or go and do our shopping for us. So that was the biggest thing for me. It was actually more productive by the intern not being in the building and being used as an additional element of support from my other teams.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. Let's put it over to me. Honestly, Gillian, that's the hardest question of the lot. I'd say for me, it centers around the flexibility, and that, flows through the access piece, diversity piece, making it more accessible, and also working around people's schedules. This is so much more able to be fitted around studies, and indeed going like alongside university work, or indeed other paid work. And that is something that rarely happens with other internships, so is a real plus. And so I hope flexibility would be my first word, but yeah, you better shut me down now, otherwise I'll be here forever.
No, that's wonderful. And I think it really does focus on how remote work changes it to the what of work and not the when of work. So I do want to thank you all. We had over 80 attendees in the room, and I thank you all for the ones who remained long after the 30 minutes to really enjoy the back and forth and the questions. Feel free to email us more if you do have any points of clarity that you would like to gain. And once again, you can join us next week on May 12th. For our final in the 3-part series, looking at how students can access and succeed at virtual internships. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Ed and Rich, and I hope you all have a wonderful Tuesday.
Thanks, Gillian. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.